Chapter 9. Walter, alone in the darkness, still found it impossible to sleep. He had never slept alone before in his short life. Always Jem or Ken near him, warm and comforting. The little room became dimly visible as the pale moonlight crept into it, but it was almost worse than darkness. A picture on the wall at the foot of his bed seemed to leer at him. Pictures always looked so different by moonlight. You saw things in them you never suspected by daylight. The long lace curtains looked like tall, thin women, one on each side of the window, weeping. There were noises about the house, creaks, sighs, whisperings. Suppose the birds in the wallpaper were coming to life and getting ready to pick out his eyes. A creepy fear suddenly possessed Walter, and then one great fear banished all the others. Mother was sick. He had to believe it since Opal had said it was true. Perhaps Mother was dying. Perhaps Mother was dead. There would be no Mother to go home to. Walter saw Ingleside without Mother. Suddenly Walter knew he could not bear it. He must go home, right away, at once. He must see Mother before she died. This was what Aunt Mary Maria had meant. She had known Mother was going to die. It was no use to think of waking anyone and asking to be taken home. They wouldn't take him. They would only laugh at him. It was an awful long road home, but he would walk all night. Very quietly, he slipped out of bed and put on his clothes. He took his shoes in his hand. He did not know where Mrs. Parker had put his cap, but that did not matter. He must not make any noise. He must just escape and get to Mother. He was sorry he could not say goodbye to Alice. She would have understood. Through the dark hall, down the stairs, step by step. Hold your breath. Was there no end to the steps? The very furniture was listening. Oh! Walter had dropped one of his shoes. Down the stairs it clattered, bumping from step to step, shot across the hall, and brought up against the front door with what seemed to Walter a deafening crash. Walter huddled in despair against the rail. Everybody must have heard that noise. They would come rushing out. He wouldn't be let go home. A sob of despair choked in his throat. It seemed hours before he dared believe that nobody had wakened up, before he dared resume his careful passage down the stairs. But it was accomplished at last. He found his shoe and cautiously turned the handle to the front door. Doors were never locked at the Parker place. Mrs. Parker said they hadn't anything worth stealing except children, and nobody wanted them. Walter was out. The door closed behind him. He slipped on his shoes and stole down the street. The house was on the edge of the village, and he was soon on the open road. A moment of panic overwhelmed him. The fear of being caught and prevented was past, and all his old fears of darkness and solitude returned. He had never been out alone in the night before. He was afraid of the world. It was such a huge world, and he was so terribly small in it. Even the cold, raw wind that was coming up from the east seemed blowing in his face as if to push him back. Mother was going to die. Walter took a gulp and set his face towards home. On and on he went, fighting fear gallantly. It was moonlight, but the moonlight let you see things, and nothing looked familiar. Once, when he had been out with Dad, he had thought he had never seen anything so pretty as a moonlit road crossed by tree shadows. But now, the shadows were so black and sharp they might fly up at him. The fields had put on a strangeness. The trees were no longer friendly. They seemed to be watching him, crowding in before and behind him. Two blazing eyes looked out at him from the ditch, and a black cat of unbelievable size ran across the road. Was it a cat? Or the night was cold. He shivered in his thin blouse, but he would not mind the cold if he could only stop being afraid of everything, of the shadows and the furtive sounds and the nameless things that might be prowling the strips of woodland he passed through. He wondered what it would be like to not be afraid of anything, like Jem. I'll just pretend I'm not afraid, he said aloud, and then shuddered with terror over the lost sound of his own voice in the great night. But he went on. One had to go on when Mother was going to die. Once he fell and bruised and skinned his knee badly on a stone. Once he heard a buggy coming along behind him and hid behind a tree till it passed, terrified lest Dr. Parker had discovered he had gone and was coming after him. Once he stopped in sheer terror of something black and furry sitting on the side of the road. He could not pass it. He could not. But he did. It was a big black dog. Was it a dog? But he was past it. He dared not run lest it chase him. He stole a desperate glance over his shoulder. It had got up and was loping away in the opposite direction. Walter put his little brown hand up to his face and found it wet with sweat. A star fell in the sky before him, scattering sparks of flame. Walter remembered hearing old Aunt Kitty say that when a star fell, someone died. Was it Mother? He had just been feeling that his legs could not carry him another step, but at the thought he marched on again. He was so cold now that he had almost ceased to feel afraid. Would he never get home? It must be hours and hours since he had left Lowbridge. It was 3 hours. He had stolen out of the Parker house at 11, and it was now 2. When Walter found himself on the road that dipped down into the glen, he gave a sob of relief. But as he stumbled through the village, the sleeping houses seemed remote and far away. They had forgotten him. A cow suddenly bawled at him over a fence, and Walter remembered that Mr. Joe Reese kept a savage bull. He broke into a run of sheer panic that carried him up the hill to the gate of Ingleside. He was home. Oh, he was home. Then he stopped short, trembling, overcome by a dreadful feeling of dissolution. He had been expecting to see the warm, friendly lights of home, and there was not a light at Ingleside. There really was a light, if he could have seen it, in a back room where the nurse slept with a baby's basket before her bed. But to all intents and purposes, Ingleside was as dark as a deserted house, and it broke Walter's spirit. He had never seen, never imagined Ingleside dark at night. It meant that Mother was dead! Walter stumbled up the drive, across the grim black shadow of the house on the lawn, to the front door. It was locked. He gave a feeble knock. He could not reach to the knocker, but there was no response, nor did he expect any. He listened. There was not a sound of living in the house. He knew Mother was dead and everybody had gone away. He was by now too chilled and exhausted to cry, but he crept around to the barn and climbed the ladder to the haymow. He was past being frightened. He only wanted to get somewhere out of that wind and lie down till morning. Perhaps somebody would come back then after they had buried Mother. A sleek little tiger kitten someone had given to the doctor purred up to him, smelling nicely of clover hay. Walter clutched it gladly. It was warm and alive, but it heard the little mice scampering over the floor and would not stay. The moon looked at him through the cobwebby window, but there was no comfort in that far, cold, unsympathetic moon. A light burning in a house down in the glen was more like a friend. As long as that light shone, he could bear up. He could not sleep. His knee hurt too much, and he was cold, with such a funny feeling in his stomach. Perhaps he was dying too. He hoped he was, since everyone else was dead or gone away. Did nights ever end? Other nights had always ended, but maybe this one wouldn't. He remembered a dreadful story he had heard to the effect that Captain Jack Flagg at the harbor mouth had said he wouldn't let the sun come up some morning when he got real mad. Suppose Captain Jack got real mad at last. Then the Glen light went on, and he couldn't bear it. Went out. And he couldn't bear it, but as the little cry of despair left his lips, he realized that it was day. Chapter 10. Walter climbed down the ladder and went out. Ingleside lay in the strange, timeless light of first dawn. The sky over the birches in the hollow was showing a faint, silvery pink radiance. Perhaps he could get in at the side door. Susan sometimes left it open for Dad. The side door was unlocked. With a sob of thankfulness, Walter slipped into the hall. It was still dark in the house, and he began stealing softly upstairs. He would go to bed, his own bed, and if nobody ever came back, he could die there and go to heaven and find Mother. Only Walter remembered what Opal had said. Heaven was millions of miles away. In the fresh wave of desolation that swept over him, Walter forgot to step carefully and set his foot heavily down on the tail of the shrimp, who was sleeping at the curve of the stairs. The shrimp's yowl of anguish resounded through the house. Susan, just dropping off to sleep, was dragged back from slumber by the horrible sound. Susan had gone to bed at 12, somewhat exhausted after her strenuous afternoon and evening, to which Mary Maria Blythe had contributed by taking a stitch in her side, just when the tension was greatest. She had to have a hot water bottle and a rub with liniment, finished up with a wet cloth over her eyes because one of her headaches had come on. Susan had wakened at 3 with a very strange feeling that somebody wanted her very badly. She had risen and tiptoed down the hall to the door of Mrs. Blythe's room. All was silence there. She could hear Anne's soft, regular breathing. Susan made the rounds of the house and returned to her bed, convinced that the strange feeling was only the hangover of a nightmare. But for the rest of her life, Susan believed she had had what she had always scoffed at, what Emily Flagg, who went in for spiritualism called a psychic experience. Walter was calling me, and I heard him, she averred. Susan got up and went out again, thinking that Ingleside was really possessed that night. She was attired only in a flannel nightdress, which had shrunk and repeated washing till it was well above her bony ankles. But she seemed the most beautiful thing in the world, the white-faced, trembling little creature whose frantic gray eyes stared up at her from the landing. Walter Blythe? In 2 steps, Susan had him in her arms, her strong, tender arms. Susan, is Mother dead? Said Walter. In a very brief time, everything had changed. Walter was in bed, warm, fed, comforted. Susan had whisked on a fire, got him a hot cup of milk, a slice of golden brown toast, and a big plateful of his favorite monkey-faced cookies, and then tucked him away with a hot water bottle at his feet. She had kissed and anointed his little bruised knee. It was such a nice feeling to know that someone was looking after you, that someone wanted you, that you were important to someone. Are you sure, Susan, that Mother isn't dead? Your mother is sound asleep and well and happy, my lamb. And wasn't she sick at all? Opal said, Well, lamb, she did not feel very well for a while yesterday, but that is all over, and she was never in any danger of dying this time. You just wait till you have had sleep, and you will see her. And something else. If I had hold of those young Satans at Lowbridge, I just cannot believe that you walked all the way home from Lowbridge, 6 miles, on such a night. I suffered awful agony of mind, Susan, said Walter gravely. It was all over. He was safe and happy. He was home. He was asleep. It was nearly midday before he woke to see sunshine billowing in through his own windows, and limped in to see Mother. He had begun to think he had been very foolish, and maybe Mother would not be pleased with him for running away from Lowbridge, but Mother only put an arm around him and drew him close to her. She had heard the whole story from Susan and had thought of a few things she intended to say to Jen Parker. Oh, Mummy, you're not going to die, and you still love me, don't you? Darling, I have no notion of dying, and I love you so much it hurts. To think that you walked all the way from Lowbridge in the night. And on an empty stomach, shuddered Susan. The wonder is he is alive to tell it. The days of miracles are not yet over, and that you may tie to. A spunky little lad, laughed Dad, who had come in with Shirley on his shoulder. He patted Walter's head, and Walter caught his hand and hugged it. There was no one like Dad in the world, but nobody must ever know how scared he had really been. I needn't ever go away from home again, need I, Mummy? Not till you want to, promised Mother. I'll never, began Walter, and then stopped. After all, he wouldn't mind seeing Alice again. Look you here, lamb, said Susan, ushering in a rosy young lady in a white apron and a cap who carried a basket. Walter looked. A baby! A plump, roly-poly baby with silky damp curls all over her head and such tiny, cunning hands. Is she not a beauty? Said Susan proudly. Look at her eyelashes. Never did I see such long eyelashes on a baby. And her pretty little ears. I always look at their ears first. Walter hesitated. She's sweet, Susan. Oh, look at her darling little curly toes, but isn't she rather small? Susan laughed. 8 pounds is not small, lamb, and she's begun to take notice already. That child was not an hour old when she raised her head and looked at the doctor. I have never seen the like of it in all my life. She's going to have red hair, said the doctor in a tone of satisfaction. Lovely red gold hair like her mother's, and hazel eyes like her father's, said the doctor's wife jubilantly. I don't see why one of us can't have yellow hair, said Walter dreamily, thinking of Alice. Yellow hair, like the Drews, said Susan in measureless contempt. She looks so cunning when she's asleep, crooned the nurse. I never saw a baby that crinkled its eyes like that when it went to sleep. She is a miracle. All our babies were sweet, Gilbert, but she is the sweetest of them all. Lord love you, said Aunt Mary Maria with a sniff. There's been a few babies in the world before, you know, Annie. Our baby has never been in the world before, Aunt Mary Maria, said Walter proudly. Susan, may I kiss her? Just once, please? That you may, said Susan, glaring after Aunt Mary Maria's retreating back. And now I'm going to make a cherry pie for dinner. Mary Maria Blythe made one yesterday afternoon. I wish you could see it, Mrs. Doctor dear. It looks like something the cat dragged in. I shall eat as much of it myself as I can, rather than waste it, but such a pie shall never be set before the doctor, as long as I have my health and strength, and that you may tie to. It isn't everybody that has your knack with pastry, you know, said Anne. Mummy, said Walter, as the door closed behind us, gratified Susan. I think we are a very nice family, don't you? A very nice family, Anne reflected happily as she lay on her bed, with the baby beside her. Soon she would be about with them again, light-footed as of yore, loving them, teaching them, comforting them. They would be coming to her with their little joys and sorrows, their budding hopes, their new fears, their little problems that seemed so big to them, and their little heartbreaks that seemed so bitter. She would hold all the threads of the Ingleside life in her hands, again to weave into a tapestry of beauty, and Aunt Mary Maria should have no cause to say, as Anne had heard her say 2 days ago, "You look dreadful tired, Gilbert. Does anybody ever look after you?" Downstairs, Aunt Mary Maria was shaking her head despondently and saying, "All newborn infants' legs are crooked, I know, but Susan, that child's legs are much too crooked. Of course, we must not say so to poor Annie, but sure, you don't mention it to Annie, Susan." Susan, for once, was beyond speech.